I include Norman Bel Geddes in a larger conversation in my History of Industrial Design class, and this year a number of students asked me interesting questions about his work. Their desire to know more about him led me to realize that in reducing all of his work to the few slides I could include, I had left out a lot of components of what makes Norman Bel Geddes so interesting. So here's a larger focus on Norman Bel Geddes. It's by no means complete, but I hope it will give you a better sense of who he was as a designer and why he's important even today. His earliest designs are very early for industrial designers. As early as 1913 and 1916, he started his career professionally as a set designer for the New York Metropolitan Opera, in Hollywood, for Max Reinhardt, and he opened his industrial design firm in 1927, which is very early for an industrial design firm in America. His firm produced a wide range of commercial products, from cocktail shakers to radio cabinets, and he was one of the first industrial designers to combine concept thinking with real-world designing. That's why students today find him so interesting. He was unafraid of large, scary, messy ideas, and at the same time able to realize real-world designs and satisfy clients. That mixture was ultimately the cause of his success and also of much of his frustration in his professional life. He was recently featured on a U.S. postage stamp celebrating the pioneers of industrial design, and he wrote in his book Horizons, "Man has one outstanding failing. He limits his horizon to what his eyes see." There's sort of no better summary of why Norman Bel Geddes is interesting. He was unwilling to limit his horizon to what he could see, and instead expanded it to what he could imagine. His firm ended up employing a number of people whose names keep appearing later in industrial design. Henry Dreyfuss was apprenticed to him in 1923, Eero Saarinen worked in the office in 1934, and Elliot Noyes was design director in the practice in 1946, and when the office closed, took over some of the commissions. Bel Geddes wrote 2 books. In 1932, he wrote Horizons, and it's sort of a glorified portfolio of his work thus far. It's really heavy with justifications that all of his unrealized work was not unreasonable and should be remembered. It's also partly an introduction to the new field of industrial design. Most early industrial designers wrote a book explaining what the profession was and how to do it, and they're really rich resources. Even now, when all of our process tools have changed, the thinking is still the same. His book is a little unusual because it's earlier than many of the others, and also it's the product of someone who was frustrated by not being able to realize many of his designs. So it's a sort of chance to reframe his work from his own perspective. In 1940, his book Magic Motorways, which is the product of a lot of the thinking he did for the 1939 New York World's Fair, is an in-depth investigation of transportation and the design proposals that he had developed for the GM Futurama exhibit at that fair, which proposed the world in 1960. And most of his suggestions involved transportation, and this book celebrates and explains those. Early in his career, he did some smaller work that is very easy to imagine writing off if you just see it in picture form. This is a window display from the Franklin Simmons department store, and I think if you looked at it, you could just write it off as very dated, a bunch of triangles, who cares? In fact, in Horizons, there's a whole chapter on display and things designers need to think about. Anyone out there who's going to consider exhibit design or window display design, trade show booth design, museum exhibit design, any sort of display work, really should read Chapter 13 of Horizons. It's an extremely well-considered investigation of how to think about displaying things. The actual solutions to the problems of display, as you can see from this picture, are quite dated, but the questions raised, the inventive solutions, and the extreme attention to process and record keeping are fascinating. The office developed a card-keeping system because Franklin Simmons' store was not close enough to their office that trips back and forth made sense. So with their catalog of parts that described the shape of the part, what other parts it combined with, the colorways, what products it could be used for, when given the theme of a window, they could assemble the design thinking in the office, communicate that to the people who would put the design into practice in the window, and be fairly certain they'd get what they wanted. Also, because it was 1929 and cost mattered more than ever, all of these pieces are reversible. In this picture, you can see a dark band around the bottom and a light surface on top. If you flip it over, you might get a completely different range of colors and textures. And the card catalog system indicated both sides and what they mixed well with. So there are all sorts of corners being cut and savings being implemented through smart design and record keeping that anyone doing display should take a look at. Bel Geddes was furious when he encountered materials used in a way that didn't investigate and honor what those materials could and should do. The Simmons Steel Bed Company at the time was making beds that were stamped steel. Those stampings were then painted to look like wood. When they hired Bel Geddes, he pointed out that stamping metal and making it look like wood is counterintuitive, and proposed a range of designs for them that celebrated what metal could do. Either sheet metal that's enameled, so you get nice even colors, rounded corners, tubing or extrusions, all sorts of different methods of working with metal that produced a new aesthetic that celebrated those production methods and that material instead of trying to disguise it. These are bad pictures because very little of this work is celebrated by existing in museum collections, but they're all over eBay. As early as 1929, Bel Geddes was already known for his work, and he was hired as design consultant for the 1933 Chicago Century of Progress exposition. Horizons is full of examples of what he designed for this show that weren't realized, and the claim has always been that they weren't realized because the Depression hit. The show went on, but everything was scaled back to save money. I would argue that the more you read about these projects, the more ridiculous they seem. The ideas are brilliant, are breathtakingly interesting, but every time I read them I think, what? You couldn't have two complete stages that at the press of a button instantly switched, where one went up and down on an elevator and moved on a set of train tracks, while the other moved on those tracks and then up on the elevator in the blink of an eye. It's just impractical. In fact, Bel Geddes was very careful to examine the engineering and make sure these were practical solutions before he finished designing them. And he's very thorough in his work. But my brain, when I read about them, still raises some flags and says, what? So I leave that to you to go read Horizons about all of these amazing projects. But they were huge-scale propositions. He proposed an open-air cabaret, multiple theaters on the campus of the show. One seated as many as 2,200 people. One of them is facing the water, and it was proposed that 400 docked canoes could enjoy the show being put on in the middle of a lagoon. There was a restaurant with an aquarium theme where the glass wall provided the aquarium feature but also worked as a dam to hold up the water, and the waterfall running over the dam ran over the restaurant windows. He also proposed this very famous aerial restaurant, which seated 1,500 people, had 3 revolving levels on top of a almost 300-foot central rod. It's a remarkable proposal. It didn't ever get built. The first revolving restaurant wasn't made until 1959, which is a good almost 30 years after he proposed this idea. And that's typical of Bel Geddes' work. You can see proposals for radical, future-thinking, way-out ideas long before they were possible, and yet he's done all the engineering to sort of point out that it could happen. Throughout his career, there's a really fascinating balance of practical work and zany work. In design, we often call it close in and far out. Things that could happen, things that may never happen. But now in design, you're sort of criticized if you don't think about far out. If you don't go for the crazy ideas and then move closer into what can happen, you might only be doing obvious things and you'd never get that flavor of the exotic and the unattainable. And as a result, you'd never arrive at creating those uncreatable things if you don't start by imagining them. Way out thinking, far out thinking, zany thinking is a big part of how design is meant to change the world and inspire new ways of doing things and seeing things. And Bel Geddes realized that without anybody telling him that. That's just part of his fabric. Many of his office's design proposals are very good close-in solutions. At the same time, he's proposing these crazy things. Here's the Toledo Scale Company. On the left is the mostly cast iron and some sheet metal stamping scale of 1925. It's extremely heavy. And on the right is a design proposal from the Bel Geddes office for a newer version. So you could look at that and say, oh, that's streamlined because that was the style at the time. In fact, the form is the result of switching to stamped aluminum so that it's thinner sheet metal and the whole affair weighs less. The office performed user surveys and discovered that people didn't trust the merchants using Toledo scales because only the merchant could see the actual weight. And the spring mechanism in the scale allowed for some adjustment, and as a result, perhaps some monkeying with the actual weight. And what Bel Geddes did was move the mechanism to the side, and then that drum on the top has a display on both the front and the back that shows the weight. So the merchant and the customer are seeing the weight at the same time. And it says right on there, no spring, honest weight, because it's a different kind of mechanism. It's interesting to note, too, in a lot of these unrealized projects, the renderings are so complete and so thorough and convincing that they're often mistaken for photographs. Remember that in 1929, 1930, there weren't books on rendering, there weren't YouTube videos on how to draw in perspective. Industrial designers had to invent these process tools to communicate things that didn't yet exist to customers who didn't have the vision to imagine them from a series of elevation drawings. And the rendering, as we know it now, is not all that different from how they developed in the 1930s. His work for the Toledo Scale Factory led to a commission to redesign the entire campus, the entire factory of the Toledo Scale Company. Again, another project killed by the Depression. The top is the office block, which did get built. On the bottom, you can see that in the upper left-hand corner. But the rest of that building is a really wonderful architectural program where the process of manufacturing is explained in the building shapes. The big drum is where the sort of heavy metal manufacturing happens, and the finished pieces work their way into the more finished building. So anyone who's interested in architecture, I'm just giving you that one slide, but those buildings are really interesting in terms of structure and also program. Bel Geddes' work as an industrial designer really began when Ray Graham of Graham Page Motors commissioned him to provide some concept thinking about what cars could look like. And he came up in 1927 with 6 different designs proposing sort of future cars. They don't look like this, but someday they could. And again, he really thought about what goes inside, where is the engine, how will you reconfigure the space. Bel Geddes was extremely interested in streamlining not as a stylistic device, but as an actual functional component of design. Things that go fast need to think about wind resistance. And these forms are all based on his streamlined studies. The cars were never built, and they weren't really ever intended to be built. It was more to sort of get designers of built cars thinking in a different way. What's interesting is, in Horizons, Bel Geddes says, "The car was never built owing to psychological factors in the human makeup that have to do with timidity." I love the idea that the only thing holding a car company back from making this car on top is that they're timid. In fact, there's a Model A Ford from 1928 below. That's the world Bel Geddes lived in when he proposed this car above. I think timidity is one word, but the gulf between these two cars is so enormous that expecting a car manufacturer or the buying public to jump from one to the other in one step is too huge a leap to imagine. Bel Geddes did participate in actual cars as well. Carl Breer, the lead engineer at Chrysler, was determined to bring streamlining and monocoque single-surface construction into automobile design. Unfortunately, customers were not really ready for this, and the car was not a success. Some have argued that it's the streamline approach or the monocoque construction. I would argue that it's just not that well balanced as a form. It's unattractive. Paul Carroll Wilson wrote of this car with this fabulous phrase, rhinocerine ungainliness. In Harper's Bazaar, the car was described as breathlessly different looking. And Bel Geddes was brought in because he was considered someone who understood style and styling and form language to see if he couldn't fix the problems with this car. The Bel Geddes version, which is just a year later, has some small interventions in form. Most notably, the grille in front becomes a sort of V-shaped chevron with the hood ornament moved forward, and the fender becomes a solid different shape. And there are a couple of other alterations. Not many alterations. They're small changes, but they were designed to sort of try and get rid of the ungainliness. The car ultimately was not a success, but Bel Geddes' participation in the process, I think, tells you some interesting things about how car design happened at the time. Bel Geddes is certainly best known for designing the General Motors Pavilion, known as Futurama, for the 1939 World's Fair. In the picture, on the upper right, you can see the actual pavilion with hordes and hordes of people queuing up to go in, and then hordes of people coming out. On the upper left, you can see this miniature world. Below that, you can see people sitting on the conveyor belt chairs that went around. The model had moving components and covered an entire acre. It showed what America would look like in 1960 and featured hundreds of thousands of miniature buildings, over 1 million miniature trees, 50,000 vehicles, 10,000 of which actually moved on a 14-lane interstate highway. So people could sit in 1939 and move around this model and marvel at the future that was on its way. There was a panorama of superhighways, of teardrop-shaped cars of the future, and using all of this work, he published his book Magic Motorways. All sorts of things are featured in this exhibit and in Magic Motorways that did, in fact, come true. Here are more images of the Futurama exhibit. On the upper left, you can see some ideas that Bel Geddes proposed. The idea of an elevated pedestrian walkway so that you never have to cross traffic. The idea that the traffic is on surface level, which is essentially a basement level to the city, so cars need not slow down to interact with the urban environment. On the right, you can see people sitting in the conveyor belt to get a sense of the scale, and there's the city with the highway going right through it. Bel Geddes wrote, "There should be no more reason for a motorist who is passing through a city to slow down than there is for an airplane which is passing over it." These are movies made from the model, and you can get a sense not only of the scale, but the intricacy, the incredible detail, and also some of the important features that are included. Bel Geddes proposed the idea of the cloverleaf, where you could maintain your speed while switching from one highway to another, where traffic didn't need to slow down as people entered or exited the highway. There were separate lanes for that. This is a world we live in. We forget that that didn't used to exist, and that's a designed situation. In 1939, the world had parkway systems, not highways. We didn't get interstate highway system until 1959. There are some things also that did not happen. Bel Geddes proposes that space between cars be maintained by sensors. He also proposed that certain lanes have curved sides to help contain cars so they don't have to steer, and the separation of commercial traffic from passenger traffic in different lanes. Transportation is one of the main threads through all of Bel Geddes' work. Here's a slide from 1945 where he's proposing a flying car. I'm showing this not because I think it's a good idea. People keep proposing flying cars. It keeps being a bad idea. But it again shows that Bel Geddes is interested in exploring the balance between big ideas and practical design solutions. He thought this whole thing through. But I also show this because one of the biggest challenges for designers is talking about the future world, talking about how a design introduction will change things, and those things don't exist yet. You have to show them somehow. We forget, with all of our digital tools, how difficult it used to be to propose a reality that didn't exist, with renderings, with models. These are done without Photoshop. These are just models that are photographed to explain a concept that didn't exist. And I think as process, it's really interesting to look at. In 1929, Bel Geddes designed airliner number 4 because it was proposed that it would exist in 1940, so it's going by decade. This ship is a 9-deck amphibian airliner, so it can land in the water, that incorporates areas for deck games, an orchestra, a gymnasium, a solarium, and 2 hangars for smaller airplanes to dock. It could hold 451 passengers, which is about 20 times the capacity of planes at the time. It flew using 20 engines and was supposed to have a 528-foot wingspan. A Boeing 747, today's largest airliner, has a 95-foot wingspan. So this is a big thing. In Horizons, he offers a thorough, sort of exhaustingly thorough outline of all the revenues that this plane would generate. $135,000 per trip, 3 trips a week is $470,000, plus a mail carrying fee of $48,000. He calculated the insurance salaries and the overhead costs. He figured out all the details of making this work, with some room to improve engineering and manufacturing because we couldn't actually build it at the time, but he felt that by 1940 we'd be able to. We now know that he was wrong because we've never managed to build it. But again, I can't tell looking at this if he was just having a crazy idea and enjoyed working out the details, or if he actually believed that this was possible. But looking at this, you have to sort of celebrate the fact that he's imagining a ridiculous, unattainable reality with the enthusiasm and energy and specifics of someone who firmly believes that this reality will come to pass. This is a rotating airport designed for New York Harbor in the water that he realized was too shallow for deep water ships, so it was sort of a liability to have that water there anyway if ships would have to avoid it. At the same time, so close to the city that it would be much more convenient to land your plane there. He calculated the 7-to-1 ratio, that's the angle of takeoff and landing for most planes. On the bottom you can see that projected over the city so that you could identify clear corridors for landing and taking off. The platform is 1,500 feet long and has 3 linked runways so you can take off and land and taxi all at the same time. There's a tunnel that's 800 feet long below that's linked to Manhattan, so you go down an elevator in the support shaft of this rotating airfield and through the tunnel with moving walkways and up into Manhattan where you just get in a taxi, and wouldn't that be convenient? This is just one of many airport ideas that Bel Geddes had. And then he also worked on real-life airplanes. So for me, it's fascinating to see that combination of impossible airliner and as-built Martin M130 China Clipper. He did interiors for Martin and for Douglas. These seem amazing to us because would you ever travel with your baby just sitting on your lap? Would you ever have a cart with food just rolling around? But remember that we don't get intercontinental flight until the 1950s. At the time, these airplanes went on short voyages. They were new, and we really didn't know what the insides could be. Early industrial designers had the amazing opportunity to explore that. Maybe they have sleeper beds. Maybe they have sofas. Maybe it's like a living room. Maybe it's like a train. And you can see evidence of all different methods of thinking, but Bel Geddes was part of that conversation as well. Bel Geddes makes a distinction, which we've lost, but I like, that streamlining is used to reduce disturbance through air or water. That's a reduction of surface drag, reduction of details on the surface so that there's less resistance. But he also talks about airfoiling, which is using the same thinking to reduce disturbance going through the air. So you use airfoiling on airplanes, you use streamlining on cars or trains. He proposes with his transatlantic liner that you need to combine these things to work together because an ocean-going vessel doesn't ever really go so fast that it needs to worry about streamlining through the water. But the air over the surface of the ship can go as much as 80 miles an hour. So the surface of the ship actually matters quite a bit. And this is, for 1932, a pretty radical form for a ship to take. My favorite of his projects are the ones that not only produce real-world objects, but do so with the incredible thorough sort of detail that he was able to shower on many of his stranger projects. So I like the hybrid projects that show a little bit of both. And this is my favorite one. In Horizons, Bel Geddes goes through the entire process of designing these stoves, and for me as a process person, it's really satisfying to see. On the left is a Vulcan gas range from 1911 to show you how primitive stoves really were. And on the right is the GE Magic Chef in 1929. GE approached Bel Geddes about redesigning that vintage of stove in 1929. I wanted to put the 1911 stove up to show you they are essentially the same device. The surfaces have been changed to be smoother and enameled metal instead of textured metal and cast iron, but otherwise they function the same way. Stoves had not advanced much at all. Bel Geddes found by interviewing women who used stoves, and that's a pretty radical idea, really. It's what designers ought to do, and now we know we need to do it. But at the time, the idea that you would actually go out and perform user interviews was a pretty new idea. And he found the single biggest complaint women had was that their stoves were hard to clean. The stove on the right, it's the SGE Oriole, eliminates all of the places where you would have trouble cleaning the stove. If the most important idea for women is the stove is hard to clean, that is going to be the primary function of the redesign. You could look at the stove and say it's a product of its time, it's streamlined, it's smooth surfaces, it's got some horizontal details to give it a sense of groundedness and movement, but really, for me, it's all about having a smooth outside surface that's easy to clean. There's also, you'll notice, no space below to trap dirt. So if cleaning is a problem, let's get rid of the legs and put it right down on the ground, and then we don't have to clean under it. These are large rectangular panels of enameled metal, and they're attached to an interior metal frame. This is in architecture called curtain wall construction. That's how skyscrapers are now built, where you have a steel frame and you put glass panels over it. That's a new method of construction for a stove, where the outside surfaces are not the structural ones. This allows the stove to be made of much thinner sheet metal, so the whole stove is lighter. It also allows these large expanses of flat metal that are easy to clean. And then we get these beautiful rounded corners because when you enamel metal, it can chip at the corners. So if you put a radius on everything, you're less likely to force a chip on the corner. All of that manufacturing and structural and material innovation leads to these beautiful forms. Another thing that came to the surface in the user surveys was the fear people have that they've left the stove on. The hinge door over the burners on the right was designed so that when you close it, the burners automatically turn off. What I love about the design process, as explained in Horizons, is how rational this whole system is. On the top, you can see a picture of the scale of the different components Underneath that, different arrangements where those components can be combined to make a small stove, a big stove, something with 2 burners or 4 burners, 1 oven and a base, different cooktops. All the different components are combined to see what you could make. For manufacturing, that's a really smart approach because with fewer components, you can get more finished products. Bel Geddes writes, "When work was started, we discovered that the client was making approximately 100 different models composed of several hundred different units, such as boilers and ovens. Eventually, after determining proper sizes, it was found that the equivalent of most of the 100 stoves that the client was then making could be made in 4 models, using only 12 different standardized units in various combinations. That is such a gift to a manufacturer to be able to reduce the amount of pieces used to make as many or more finished objects." On the picture on the upper right, you can see a wire rack. That's another Bel Geddes introduction. You can use less material and have something that actually performs in a better way. Bel Geddes also took his interests and applied them to architecture. We saw his proposals for theaters before. He kept proposing ways that design could change not just the object environment, but the architectural environment of the time. This is a house that he designed as part of a project that Ladies' Home Journal offered called The House of Tomorrow. This magazine was widely read and is often credited with helping make streamlining in architecture a popular idea in the 30s. These are some better images that show you not only the massing of the building and the surfaces, but the floor plan. He imagined that this would be steel construction, so again, curtain walls where the openness of the floor plan is possible because the structure is removed from the walls. That also allows for lots of windows and larger windows. And a lot of his discussion about this building involves the quality of light, how artificial and natural light can be manipulated to create moods and effects. That comes right out of his experience as a theater designer, and it's something that I think early industrial designers really brought into their work as they learned about industrial design, their understanding of set design and exhibit design. If you look at the round form in front, that's a garage with a turntable, so you pull in and then your car turns around. And on top, there's a funny sort of flat disc. That's an umbrella on the terrace off of the children's room, and there's a sandbox underneath. So no detail was too small for consideration in this house. Bel Geddes also proposed a gas station for Saucony Gas that was a rationalized, prefabricated system of construction. Remember that gas stations in the 20s and 30s were a mishmash of different kinds of buildings, designed by architects, built by builders, and industrial designers started to get involved because they realized that these buildings are small and can be made out of components and are essentially very large manufactured items and parts of systems. So this is a very early 1935 idea about pre-manufactured components that could be put together into a gas station. It did not end up getting built because of timidity. Again, the company felt that their customers would not embrace so undecorated a building. They needed a cornice. That was their big objection. It has no cornice. So they went with a different plan. And it's interesting that Walter Dorwin-Teague, another great early designer, designed the Texaco stations that are still all over the country. There were over 20,000 of those built, and it used many of the same ideas about prefabrication and large panel construction. In the end, what Bel Geddes is best remembered for are 2 iconic objects that help define the Art Deco era. If you ask about Art Deco design in America, you end up seeing these 2 objects. So that's his legacy. He is part of the canon. American Art Deco, American Industrial Design, Norman Bel Geddes, here you go. I can't help but think that's such a sad sort of missed opportunity because these objects ultimately only show the close-in thinking of Bel Geddes' office, the real world, pay the bills, get some stuff made component. They don't have that same crazy brain going on, but we need to look at them because they really do tell interesting stories about the times. The Soda King for Walter Kitty is one of my favorite objects because all it does is carbonate water or carbonate your drink so that you can have a bubbly drink. Remember that in 1935 there was a lot of focus on drinking in America. Prohibition had gotten people very focused on alcohol. This would be a great celebration of that time. It also visually says all the things we want the Art Deco to say. It's shiny, it's chrome, it looks like a bullet, it's going fast, even if it's just carbonating your drink. But the reality is it's made by Walter Kitty, which was a company that made fire extinguishers. And they found that fire extinguishing systems on ships damaged the cargo. And in looking for a different way to put out fire on ships specifically, they arrived at carbon dioxide, which needed to be released in a quick burst to extinguish a fire. So they developed a siphon device that sort of sends out a quick explosion of carbon dioxide to put out a fire. And in the Depression in America, most corporations that made something were pretty desperately looking for other ways to use that technology to make more income out of what they already had. And Walter Kitty realized that this same quick burst of carbon dioxide could carbonate a beverage. That's how this object came into being. A fire extinguishing manufacturer realized there was a cocktail component in what they did, and Norman Bel Geddes gave it form. This object is in almost any museum collection that wants to have objects that define the Art Deco. It's the Manhattan cocktail set made by Revere, a Massachusetts metal manufacturer. And it tells a really interesting component of the Bel Geddes story. The executive at the Bel Geddes office in charge of the Revere account was Frances Waite, who later married Bel Geddes. And she was a trained designer and later equal partner in the company. Many give her credit for the Revere designs because she was in charge of that account. They produced many, many drawings, and in the 1935 Revere catalog, there are 17 designs by the Bel Geddes office. This is a normal way for industrial design firms to operate, especially the larger ones. There's no way to know who in the firm did what. So the Bel Geddes name is certainly attached to the Manhattan cocktail set. But what I find interesting, again, is that the Depression forced Revere to do some funny things. On the left is the Manhattan candle holder and the Manhattan tray, designed by Frederick Price, as seen in the 1936 Revere catalog. Those pre-existed. On the right, you'll recognize that same tray. When you add the Norman Bel Geddes cocktail shaker and cups, it suddenly becomes a Norman Bel Geddes design. So we give him credit for that tray, even though it existed before he arrived in the Revere catalog. In fact, another savings helps define this, I think, as a really funny puzzle for the Art Deco period. If you look at the cocktail shaker's lid, it is a stamped cylinder. If you look at the cup, it's that lid turned over and soldered onto a base. In an effort to get more mileage out of that one piece of tooling, because tooling is expensive, they realized that they could recycle that one part and make more. So what I love about this object is that it is one of the most iconic objects from the Art Deco period. It celebrates verticality and sort of skyscraper construction, and it looks like a little forest of buildings when you get it all together on the tray. In fact, if you scratch the surface and examine it, it's a manufacturer's desperate attempt to get farther with the same amount of stuff or less by combining things in a smart way. There was a round tray designed to go with this cocktail set, but they decided to wait and make it later, and then this was so successful that they decided not to bother. In 1935, IBM had introduced the electric typewriter, and that typewriter remained unchanged for a long time. In 1943, the Bel Geddes office got the commission to redesign this typewriter, but in 1947, the office closed. There was a problem between the partners in the company, there were financial problems, so the office closed, but they had a contractual obligation to finish this design. Elliot Noyes, who worked in the office and was design director there, took over the project and opened his own office. If you're a fan of the IBM Selectric typewriter, introduced in 1969, a really interesting and important typewriter, that's designed by Elliot Noyes. He worked for most of his career with IBM in many, many different ways, and that project started at the Bel Geddes office. So the typewriter here is a Norman Bel Geddes design, ended up being finished by Elliot Noyes. As a process note, this is a photograph of the original typewriter with measurements for before and after proposed changes. It's a fascinating document because what they're realizing is the inner guts were not changing. We're just looking at the shell that goes around it and updating that. So what are the things we're stuck with and what are the things that are negotiable? What can we change and what can we not change? I love that they did this right on a photograph. I'm ending with the Bel Geddes Patriot Radio because I started with that. That's the object that made it onto the stamp, so it must be the most famous, right? I might argue otherwise, but it's an interesting project nonetheless. I find it more interesting to look at other Bel Geddes proposals for radios because radios were a really important technology at the time. In 1920, the first public broadcasts were made in radio, and RCA obtained the commercial broadcast license to broadcast in America in 1921. As soon as 1929, over 10 million families owned radios, and Americans spent over $850 million a year on radio equipment. So imagine no internet, no iPhone, no television, radio. you have radio. Everybody has a radio. By the 1930s, they are so prevalent, and as components for the insides get smaller and new materials arrive for designers, designers get the great opportunity of reinventing what radios look like. They're not big pieces of furniture anymore, they're smaller objects. Bakelite plastic is moldable and castable, and as a result, there are certain forms that it wants to be. It wants to have rounded corners and smooth surface. It needs to have some support to keep it from warping, so you get fins. And also, radios require some particular thinking. You need to have an area where the sound comes out, and you need to have another area where the heat comes out. So there need to be two places that emit one sound, one heat. Other than that, the shape of a radio is sort of negotiable. But there are all sorts of questions the designer has to ask. How do the knobs explain themselves? Where do I put the knobs? On, off, you just use once, but the change the station you might use repeatedly in any given interaction with the radio. The radio on the top is a prototype for Majestic 651. It's such a rich form. I love that the radio is just a rectangle, but that waveform on the front not only celebrates the fact that it's molded out of plastic and you can make that shape, but it also tells a story of what this object does. Sound will come out here. It's giving you a form that explains that narrative. And that's not really something industrial designers do much until the 1980s. So to see Bel Geddes thinking about that in 1939 is exciting. And on the bottom is a rendering, a really beautiful drawing that almost looks like a photograph, but it's a rendering of the 651 as it was realized. Here's a picture of the actual thing next to the rendering, so you can see there are some differences, but not too many. And this is a celebration of what Bakelite can do, how small the radio components could be. Again, user survey questions. People wanted push buttons to be able to program radio stations. That was an important introduction into this radio that wasn't there originally. But the radio that he's famous for is the Patriot radio. For my dollar, it's Bel Geddes Light. The knobs have stars on them to make them seem more American. It sort of looks like a flag. They were made in red, white, and blue. It does everything a radio needs to do, and it's serviceable. It doesn't have any of the zany, wonderful thinking that his prototypes had and that much of his other work had. There are all sorts of other Bel Geddes projects that I'm not showing because they don't really tell the story in any clearer way. I have to show these two just because they're so compelling to me. On the left is the Harvard Mark I computer, the first real computer in America. It's all mechanical, it's gears. It's a really clumsy affair, but it had no precedent. And people didn't know what it should look like or how you would interface with it. And Bel Geddes was brought in as a consultant to help propose ideas, not only for its case as an aesthetic object, but also to help explain its use. And on the right is a fairly humble metal school desk, but I think it arrives at such a beautiful form language that is reminiscent of all of Bel Geddes' transportation work and his interest in form and streamlining. At the same time, it's completely appropriate for a school desk and what this needs to do with a structure on the base. So I just like these two objects enough that I wanted to force them in here. Bel Geddes wrote in Horizons, "For the artist, it is essential that he should be an explorer and delve into the future, both spiritually and materially. And if he works in the ideas and materials of his own age, he inevitably stamps his personality, sensitiveness, and ideas upon the world." This is just an assortment of other things I didn't show you. There are so many Bel Geddes proposals and suggestions and designs. If this is interesting to you, I encourage you to seek them out, because it is always true that if you pursue what's interesting to you with enough vigor and in a thorough enough way, you'll get somewhere really interesting. And I like to think that that's why my students this year were so excited about Bel Geddes, because they see that potential in themselves. The idea that the world is giving you opportunities, and that's not the only path that should be open to you. You should be able to forge your own opportunities by pursuing your own interests and marrying those to what the world is requiring of you. So there you go, Norman Bel Geddes in 39 slides.